This is chapter 3 of On the Brink of Everything, Grace, Gravity, and Getting Old. And as we have started in the past couple weeks with some scriptures, it is called Bible study, so I feel the necessity to have a couple passages that connect to what we're doing. My general introduction before I read the passage, just to make them link, is if you read, these were very interesting. I mean, they were just sort of in themselves. The readings for this week tapped into a lot of Parker's other readings and writings, and so you got a little glimpse, a bit of his broader thing. This is really what he's at the heart of the sense of Parker as a writer, as a spiritualist, is know thyself. What does it mean to be real? What does it mean to be whole? What does it mean to be grounded? And you see those themes tremendously running through. And I think the idea that he's getting at, although not explicitly in an aging way, is how often do we consider how we are living our lives in an intentionally contemplative way? And that's where he goes into the contemplation by catastrophe. He's acknowledging he himself is not a natural I resonate so much with this myself. I mean, I've contemplated monasticism in my own life from various aspects, from considering being a monastic to studying a monastic community and writing about it. I mean, my dissertation is on a monastic community. And to the extent that if I said if something, God forbid, ever would happen to Shannon, I would probably end up in Tisday. It is just a part of my rhythm and a part of my thinking. So I resonate with the idea of monastic tendencies, but expressed in everyday life. So, but what I want to point to in this chapter, and where I would like to leave at the end of this time together, is one, asking, because I think a lot of what he talks about is idealistic, and a lot of it actually taps into what I would call, and I don't want to put this in the terms of left, right, or liberal, conservative in our current conversation, but like I've spoken about it in the summer, liberal theology or liberal spirituality is oriented around the perception of self and relationship to and God through the lens of the self, rather than through the lens of the collective community, the scriptures, and revelation of God as well. And so Parker Palmer does dip a little bit into the humanistic side in these chapters, and I want to point that out because I think he ends trying to say, know yourself. And this is actualization of the self is the most important, and that there's a true self in all of us. And so what I want to read is two passages that orient that entire framework of what he's talking about in the context of the Christian message. And so for one, we're going to go back to Genesis 1, and it says in Genesis 1:26, and God said, let us, remember there were plurality of God, let us make man or human, and man is technically, the word is Adam or Adama, meaning the ground or the earth. Adam's name means ground or earth. It's a sense of that. It comes from the ground, Adama. But let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over the earth, and over everything creeping that creeps the earth. So God created man or human in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and of the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, behold, I give you every plant yielding seed on the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird in the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, I have given everything that has breath, the breath of life. I have given every green plant for food. And so it was so. God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. The only very in all of the days, the acclamations at the ends of the days of creation. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. And the reason I go back to this passage, and the reason why this passage is critical to really have a lens to understand Palmer, is we come from as he does, but he's in the spirituality or humanistic side a little bit. We understand ourselves as Christians as being created in God's image. It means we are differentiated from the beasts. We have a sense of self. We have a sense of reflection. He talks about ego, talks about all of these things that come on. Everything he's dealing with goes back to who we were created to be. And so, in some sense, if we don't start with the foundation that humanity was created in the image of likeness of God, we've been given the capacity to commune, we've been given the capacity to contemplate, we've been given the capacity to be logical and thoughtful and reorient our lives in a way that animals haven't. And I think it's important to remind ourselves that is a unique touch of God upon us, because as we ask the question of who is our true self, it's easy to say, who am I in my present self? This is the problem with a lot of arguments in our culture today. Um, who am myself in my embodiment is more important than who am I in myself in the essential nature of who I am, which we claim and we believe is spiritual. And that doesn't mean that we don't take care and consideration and love, and we are inclusive, and we are non-discriminators of those in front of us. But to put it in a racial sense, just in the sense, and you could put this in sexual orientation, you could put this in sexuality, in any sort of deviation that you have out there in terms of of how humanity expresses itself. In any one of those instances where we are meant to actualize who we are in and of our physical material world selves over and above who we are in our essential selves and our spirit, we drift from the way God created us. Because we are more focused on the 70, 80, 90 years we have on this world than we are in the eternity that we have with God. And I think that it's a challenge that Western Christianity has across the board. We condemn hedonism, yet we all participate in micro hedonism every single day. From the dopamine rushes we get from watching little funny videos, to the food that we indulge in, to the beauty that surrounds us. Those are hedonistic. And that doesn't say that God doesn't want us to enjoy the environment we're in, but to say that we talk about who our true selves, we have to understand our true selves in the relationship of the image of God in us. Anyone want to make a comment on that before I switch to the next verse? No? All right. The next verse jumps ahead to Romans, and this is an interpretation. One of the things that I think I'm toying around with going through Romans next in the spring together, because Romans is an incredible book, and it basically summarizes what most of the Protestant church believes about faith, and sometimes it's worth digging into that. But Romans, let me back up here for the to verse 20. For the creation was subject. I'll go with verse 18, Romans 8:18. For I consider the suffering of this present time not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed in us. And the reason I'm reading that is because the notion of we suffer in our physicality and our sense of self and our confusion of who we are and how we exist, that's a form of suffering. It's a pursuit for a meaning and identity in our lives and belonging. And that is a form of angst and anxiety. Who am I in the world? We've all asked ourselves that. For I consider the suffering of this present time not worth comparing to the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility in the fall, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, meaning God, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. Meaning what we are living in now, the sense of self, our pursuit, all of your vocational aspirations, all of your 401ks, all of your security in this life don't mean jack. If I had a mic, I'd drop it. For we know that the whole creation have been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only that the creation what we have for ourselves, we who are of the first fruits of the Spirit, and that means that we have the Spirit dwells in us because of Pentecost. We're the first fruits of the Spirit, grown inwardly as we wait eagerly for the adoption as sons and the redemption of our bodies. That means that this material world will not last. The things those deep existential questions are one of the few things that we can ask that taps into a sense of who we are in the essence of who we are, not in our material estimations, not in our fleshly space in this world. For in this hope we are saved. New hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait with it for an impatience. And here we get to the part that I want to get to. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know what to pray for as we ought. but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. This is a contemplative life. Prayer without ceasing, constantly in a state of analyzing and wondering and engaging. And this is one of the things I love about the monastic tradition is there are those in this world who are of our, bless you, species, who live and dwell in this intentional space every single day. Does that mean it's for everyone? No. But in an ideal world, perhaps it would be. Perhaps in an ideal world, we wouldn't want in the material world, but we'd be in a place where our lives were centered around prayer and community and a new way of dwelling in this world, in a way that actually provides a sense of actual existence in God's kingdom. He who searches his heart knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. Here it is. For we know that those who love God, all things work for good, and for those who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. For those whom he predestined, he also called, and from those he called, he also justified, and from those he justified, he also glorified. And for those of us who believe, this means that this isn't a casual thing. If you take Paul at face value from a Reformed perspective, we were chosen to be here. We were chosen to be followers of Christ. And because of that, we were chosen to bear an image differently and to be defined differently than the way that the world tells us to define ourselves. And I don't think we can approach, in other words, the illusion that we experience where Palmer talks about this, I think that's real. He hit the illusion part on the head. But the reality for those who claim to be Christians is different from the reality of those who do not, because we claim a reality that is not in existence in front of us, and therefore we patiently wait. So allow that to just frame as we read and as we share. The other thing I wanted to point out, anyone want to make any comments about that? Yeah. Are you mad because I said your 401k doesn't mean jack?
That's right.
Because we want you to still give to the church,
If everybody lived this monastic life, would there be procreation? Would there be people going forth and taking care of the animals and growing things? Wouldn't that kind of
no? You could have yes. I know, because I mean the notion of celibacy as being not being engaged in a marital or procreative relationship is a part of monasticism. There are three parts of monasticism. First order, which is men, or monks or brothers. Second order, which are nuns or sisters, and then there's the women. The third order is often called secular monastics, or you may have heard of a Benedictine oblate, like add to Benedictine oblate, and you connect yourself to a monastery, so you end up living by some sort of monastic, sort of communal way. And there's lots of intentional Christian communities. Quite frankly, and I haven't made this any secret, I've said this probably a dozen times over since my time here, is I would love to see us living more like an intentional Christian community. We have the perfect environment. Everyone is 5 minutes away. We can ring a bell. We can all join for prayer. The reason, one of the reasons that defines Cizé as a community is that it says 3 times a day where everyone in the entire community is stopping what we're doing. We're coming to church together. We're going to pray together for half an hour, 40 minutes, whatever it might be, because that is our first calling, is to commune with God and to one another. And then the work and everything else flows out of that. And that's not to say that we have to come together 3 times a day, but that idea of we are called to bring about the reality of the kingdom of God in this present life. And that means in our relationships, then when you and I get an argument, we work it out. And someone says, wow, I can't believe you worked that out. Well, that's what we're called to do. It's not an option. And that's what, and so when we start living that sense of reality of who we're called to be as Christians, I think that we find our sense of fullness and hope, not, and this is where I would argue with Palmer, is not, I think, in the actualization of who we see ourselves and our material self in this world. We find our identity not in digging deep into ourselves, unless we are digging deep into ourselves and seeking Christ. So that's just the caveat that I think that it's important to when you consider what it means to be your essential self, your existential existence of who you are as a person, that is not something that we define for ourselves. That is something that is given to us, that does come with oughts, as he talks about. Okay. Last thing I want to say is I was telling my friend about this book who lives in Chicago, and he's one of my favorite armchair theologians. We went to Wheaton together. And apparently there's a columnist named Studs Terkel. Anyone heard of him? He's a Chicago columnist, but he's got a series of these books where he basically interviews people and writes up their reflections on life topics. And this one's on reflections on death, rebirth, and hunger for a faith. I have not started reading this, but anything that Doug recommends to me, I would, if he says, oh, if you're reading this, you got to read this. So you're welcome to take a look at this after, or borrow it or whatever. I'll probably noodle around in it at some point. All right, well, let's dig into this. I think that just as a way of, for those who haven't read, I do want to read before he jumps into his explanation of all the different sections. He sort of names something on page 54 that is kind of the notion of a spiritual life, and I want to read just a section of that so that everyone's on the same page of how he starts, and then we'll get into the actual essays. He talks a lot about Thomas Merton. If you're not familiar with Thomas Merton, he's a monk and actually his abbey is Abbey of Gethsemane is outside of Louisville, and so there's a statue of Merton in Louisville. Merton was one of the spiritual monastic contemplatives of the last century that you would put him in sort of he would put Parker Palmer as a contemporary version of what Merton was doing without the monastic sense of, but he's one of the few monks of the, I'm trying to think who else, Wendell Berry. Some of you have heard of Wendell Berry. He's in the same category as that, poet, writer, philosopher, spiritualist, and in this case monastic, but Merton influenced Palmer a lot. But he says this on page 54. The spiritual journey is an endless process of engaging life as it is, and suggesting that we, in our aging, should be on a spiritual journey, stripping away our illusions about ourselves, our world, and the relationships of the two, moving closer to reality as we do. That process begins with losing the illusion that spirituality will float us above the daily fray. Reality may be hard, but it's a safer place to live than in our illusions, which will always fail us, and at no point is more true than in old age. Death is, after all, the end of all of our illusions. I'd like to add, death is also the end of our reality. So why? But not really. Not really. I mean, it is, but in our earthly reality. And some might say, for those of you who studied the world religions with us today, there are Christian Science and Scientology, and there are some that would say that we're living in an absolute illusion, and that the reality that we live is actually what happens after this. So perhaps our reality doesn't end, but our actual reality begins in some way. So why not do what we can to lose our illusions before death strips them from us? That way we are less likely to die disappointed or in despair. So I guess I just throw that out there for those of you who live decades more than I have. When you hear a fellow older person saying, "Hey, we've lived our lives based on illusions of this world, and what does it mean to be my real self?" How does that strike you? Anyone online? Crickets. Oh, there you go. Glenda's gonna.
Some of you may have heard that the Merriam-Webster word of the year this year is authentic.
Ah,
That's right.
How ironic.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it is a longing that people have to live what they consider an authentic life, and yet there's a lot that keeps us, pressures around us, or our upbringing, or our expectations of other people that keep us from feeling like we are authentic or our true selves.
Yeah.
But to go back to what you were saying before, I don't know if we all could be authentic monastic residents, because I think God makes us of many different types of personalities, and some of us become very restless and dissatisfied in that kind of environment.
Like Jim.
And I don't know about it, but I think that's a good way for some people to live, but it may not be.
Wake up, Jim.
I'm pointing to Jim and sitting in the background,
I'm here.
He's listening.
like that puppet
I'll
that
keep
sits
him
up there
awake.
and critiques everything.
Yeah.
No, I think that's true, and I don't think the monastic life is for everyone, but I do think that there is a monastic element in everyone. I just don't
Yes.
think we often have tapped into that. I think there is something that seeks that which is real and that which is grounded and that which is not puffed up by, and this is dealing with young people over the years. This has been the biggest challenge I've faced. We live in a vision of life that says, let's stick our kids in the best preschool daycare that they can, that'll teach them the alphabet earlier than everyone else, which will give them a jump. And then, well, let's get them coding lessons and let's get them tutors and let's get them, music lessons and sports. And we put all this emphasis into then getting the right grades to get into the right school, so that you can get the right education, so that you can get the right job, so that you can earn enough money to have a happy life, so that you can go and spend your life in a retirement community at the end. And there's this vision that we cast for our young people that almost is impossible to achieve for all young people, but B, really doesn't end in that general. I mean, we have more than ample testimony and witness that doesn't end in happiness.
Well, so you had asked older generation, and I would say that the illusion is continually shifting, because you have, like you said, you have an illusion when you're 20 that this is what life should be and what's going to make me happy. And now I look back and I think, well, the illusion or the belief that I had at 30 was different than 20, and then at 40, and even now. And I realize now, as you get older, you realize, like you said, none of that
matters. Yeah.
None of that up to that point, except for maybe having your children, really matters in the big scheme of things. It just doesn't.
Yeah. Al, you about to say something?
Okay. You look back at
nice and loud.
Piggybacking on that a little bit, we are daily bombarded with things telling us what we should be. You should have this brand of clothing. You should be drinking this or eating that. It's the latest trend. And if you're not doing it, you're not in the crowd. The kids that watch TikTok and all those commercials and stuff, they get it day after day hammered at them as to what the reality of the world is. And they live that kind of reality because of fear of being rejected by peers. Yeah. And that's where the reality comes, is from the group mentality think, bombarded by advertising agencies on where you should live, where you should do this, and where you should do that. And you think about that. That's daily, just everywhere you go. You watch 20 minutes of a movie and you get 10 minutes of commercials.
Well, and I think it's the facade of authenticity as well. Like this, in some sense, young people put out themselves in a more vulnerable way because they don't have the sense of the other person sitting across the table and you're saying something that you shouldn't. So there is an authenticity there, but there's also a constructed identity for the consumption of everyone else. It's kind of like when I love the room, and I just don't know, maybe as I looked at one, I've seen other ones, but I see these memes about basically, 20 years ago, we carried our phones and our cameras were separate devices, and none of us took pictures of our food. So, I mean, it's like, you and sending pictures to people to say, what, I'm living a good life, or look at my adventure. And then and although we know consciously that everything that people portray on social media is an idealized projection of their life and the highlights of their life rather than the everyday, even though we know that, we still then as humans experience jealousy, or I wish I was there, or I wish my food was better, or I wish, and it's the and what does that create? Harmony and communion and connection and a tighter bond? No, it creates dissension. It creates wanting more. It creates material lust.
Right.
And so we live in this world where the illusion that we live in is devastating, and we maybe, you know, and I would say I'm in the cusp of that generation that still can dabble in it but reject it. I think that that's where the older generation has been saved of some of that. The younger generation, they're slaves to it.
Well,
Yeah, I know that.
illusion can change so quickly. We just watched a show on Ukraine, a couple, and they were talking to the different people, and all of a sudden, the idea of, you know, going to work tomorrow, worrying about, do I paint my house and stuff, all of that's been stripped away. And it's, how do I feed my child tomorrow?
Yeah. Yeah.
How do I find medical care for this child that has cancer? It was about children in Ukraine with cancer. And it just strips everything away to the bare minimum.
Think about it in the pandemic. I mean, you know, all of a sudden, and when the fear of if you walked into a grocery store, you're going to get a life-threatening, possibly deadly disease, but you needed to eat. You know, I was listening to a comedian on the way to taking Judah down. He was talking about the pandemic, and he said, you know, that there are a bunch of men who were like, "I'll provide for our family." I'm, you know, like they're going out to kill. Yeah, they're like, I'll brave the dangers of the world so that my family. But what it was, we were as a culture in a very, you know, Western way reduced to these things, and you know what there was panic, there was anxiety, there was fear. But you know, and that's a good reality check, actually, to say what does matter.
In my opinion, is that 90% of our problems would be cured if we got rid of all social media and all public media.
Well,
All,
I don't know about the
news
percentage,
media.
but
But that will tell you too. They say that we're the most connected generations ever and ever, instant generation.
But not
But
truly.
but the loneliness that is still there with people, because as he will talk about, the no interaction, the no
Right.
community part of it,
Oh,
it's
yeah.
all individual.
More lonely.
That's
more
lonely, and you can talk to anybody in the world,
And
you can
that-
look up anything. But
And
you're
that
still,
truly is, if you go back and really look at basic psychology, that one of the strongest instincts is the tribal instinct. And that's what was put us in Neanderthal days, so we could fight the saber-toothed tiger.
well, it is. It's
But, I mean,
survival.
yeah.
I mean, and you find survival and belonging, and if you belong, you know you have protection. If you have
Yeah.
protection, you know, so
Yeah.
it feeds this sense, the basic sense of if you're out in the woods by yourself, you're less safe than if you're with 5 people than if you're by yourself.
Right.
So all this is to say, we'll jump into the first one, contemplative by catastrophe. This is about being grounded in a sense of who we are, but keep that in the lens. And as you wrestle with this, and as you think about some of these, always keep the lens in front of that. It's not about who we are in our material self. It's who we are in our eternal self. So let's jump in. Page 50 starts on page 55, contemplative by catastrophe. And I would say, and if anyone at home wants to jump in there, just shout out or unmute yourself. But contemplative by catastrophe, I would say versus contemplative by intention is what he makes the sort of contrast. So, but what stood out to you in this chapter? Anything in this chapter that stood out, or this section that stood out
I
to you?
love your sense of humor.
We'll go ahead and read nice and loud if there's a part that you liked.
I'm so stuffed up that I.
Okay, I can read if you want. Tell me
Well,
which to
I've
read.
got a smiley face for when he starts that. Unfortunately, he's going to be a monk, and unfortunately, there were several major obstacles.
Yeah, no, I related to
Am I?
that. Yeah, I said, you know.
Minor issue. And the way he ended it. Yeah, read that paragraph.
Which one? Unfortunately?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there were several. So he's talking about his desire, and I resonate with it in terms of a monastic sense. So, unfortunately, there were several major obstacles between monkhood and me. I was married, the father of 3 children. I had a job in which my family depended, and was considerably more Quaker than Catholic. Although I will disabuse that notion, monasticism is not about Catholicism. Monasticism existed about 800 years in its hermitage form, and then in the 4th century in its communal form, long before the Catholic Church was ever defined as the Catholic Church. Benedictine spirituality is not Catholic theology. Trappist theology is Catholic, as is Cistercian, but Benedictine is not. And so is Franciscan. Clearly, my visions of the monastic life were hallucinations. So instead of applying to become a novice at Gethsemane, I ordered one of the Abbey's famous fruitcakes, which are soaked and aged in the fine Kentucky bourbon.
That's so cute.
Is that really true?
Well,
It is, yeah.
What, that they're soaked in Kentucky bourbon? Or
Yeah, the fruitcakes are.
So where is this?
It's right outside. It's outside of Louisville. It's in Kentucky.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Like there's a statue of Merton downtown. I had a retreat on his. I held a retreat at his center. So I
Have
mean,
you read a lot of his work?
I've probably 3. I think 2 or 3.
He's Palmer seems to just.
I was just really
I mean, that's where he gets his.
Yeah, and Merton, I would say, is kind of like primary source literature. He's just talking to the world, and that's just his call. And I would say that that this is kind of secondhand Merton, but Merton, Wendell, Palmer, Rohr, spiritualists in our culture, and they're going to resonate with the world spirituality as well. I mean, you sense, you look at the and as you see, he mentions the Dalai Lama, he mentions other faiths. It is a broader understanding of the human pursuit for understanding that leads them into this. I mean, they're existential philosophers that are, put into positions and public activists and, and sometimes monks. Anything else?
Well, everything going back into contemplative, look at, like he puts a train wreck scenario in.
Yeah.
I think most of us do that. It's kind of like, hey, watch me. And then it's like, what the heck went wrong with that? And we don't spend the time forward thinking and looking at kind of both sides of that. And the other part of that, on page 55, that is Welcome Home. It's a poem that I wrote taking a walk through those frozen woods. When I broke through the fearful illusion that I am not worthy of being here, back to the truth that I am, as well as we all are. The truth we need to know before we die, that we belong here. And that feeling that I don't really fit in. No, you do. And in his poem, I thought,
I was to say, skip the poem is the very last thing of the chapter. Do you, for those of you who didn't hear, let me read. You want to hear it since Al's bringing it. It's called "Welcome Home" and it's by Parker Palmer. Alone in the alien snow-blown woods. That's very fitting for us now. Moving hard to stay warm in zero weather. I stop on the rise to catch my breath as the sun, setting through bare-boned trees, falls upon my face, fierce and full of life. I'm sure we can all relate to times where we have seen the setting of the sun go down over the... breathing easy now, breathing with the earth. I suddenly feel accepted. Feel myself stand on my own ground, strong, deep-rooted as a tree, while time and all these troubles disappear. I mean, I think for those of us who have lived in this environment, when we walk in the woods, there are times where you're like, it doesn't matter. And when, who knows how long, I move down on the trail and find my ancient burdens returning, I stop once more to say no to them. Not here, not now, not ever again, reclaiming the welcome home the woods have given me.
Cool.
So very fitting for where we are. And I think that's the challenge is that I think that anyone who moves to Lake City is probably already in that existential, I think you all, in some, it's like preaching to the choir, you all have some recognition of wanting a different life.
Mm-hmm.
You're retiring here, you're going slower, you want to breathe the air, you want to participate in smaller communities. So the very things that bring you to Lake City very much tap into the ethos that Parker Palmer is talking about.
One of the other things he talks in here about that, looking back at the catastrophe, he says, but now not a lot of people ever think about when they do something right and think about what went right.
Mhm.
and why that worked and the like, and understand
Yeah.
when I succeed and I fail. Success, oh, yeah, I'm just supposed to do that. Not necessarily. What did I do right? I don't think we ever think about that.
Yeah.
No,
Or
I
what
don't
did you
think so.
learn from the
Human-
catastrophe?
Right.
Human nature, negative
Negative.
imprints more on the brain. They know
Mhm.
that. And catastrophe more on
Yeah.
the brain for whatever reason. And maybe it's because of sin.
I passed the test
You
because
know?
I studied, you know.
Yeah, maybe it's because of sin. So
Yeah.
maybe we're destined to look at what we do wrong.
In part, trauma produces emotion, and emotion attached to the memories that your hippocampus creates are trigger points. And this is why trauma can be recalled in sudden moments. And then everything that surrounded that trauma is brought back into the brain, including the emotion. Whereas the happy moments you have are often not the ones you remember, which is why often children with traumatic childhoods have more childhood memories than those with good childhoods. So
Right.
if you're like, I don't remember much from my childhood, that may be a blessing. It means that you had a balance. I don't remember much. I had a pretty happy childhood. I didn't have any, major trauma in my life, but I don't have a lot of memories from other than the pictures that I look at.
Right.
Whereas someone else who has trauma in their lives, they can remember all sorts of stuff, and all sorts of stuff trigger those memories. So, what else in that first section stands out to you? Anyone online?
Jason,
Up
I've
here.
got
Oh.
something. I'm not
Okay, yes,
online.
go for it. Kay, while the online people get their acts
On-
together.
On 57, at the, kind of at the top, all forms of contemplation share the same goal. Yeah. To help us see through the deceptions of the self and world in order to get in touch with what Howard Thurman called the sound of the genuine within us and around us. And I think that's what we're all, you talked about being authentic, is that genuine, authentic soul connection.
Yeah.
Where we're not in the false self.
Yeah.
We're operating out of the true self.
Yeah. Yeah, and I just putting that in even the context of worship. I think it's so easy to sit and worship and go through the motions of this is church. We're going to sit here, and your mind comes in and out. And I think all it takes is an intentionality for an hour to be thoughtful about that, and that have some reflection about that, of not having the illusion of church, but saying, what does it mean when I'm saying this affirmation of faith? What does it mean when I'm singing Jesus Remember Me? What does it mean when I pass the peace? Not just a greeting, but I'm actually physically passing peace between one another. Like, if we believe in these spiritual realities, that brings those acts, those practices more to a contemplative level of interaction than it does from that surface illusionary level.
I also like, kind of at the bottom of 57, failure is one of the many forms contemplation can take.
Yeah.
Like that.
Well, that goes back to the catastrophe. I've done more contemplation around my life when I was fired from Seattle.
Exactly.
And I've grown, and it goes back to the
When you're
beginning.
in a
That's
crisis.
those are the fibers of my weave, of my fabric of my life that are the strongest, because they endured the most testing. What else? Anyone online? I saw Chris looking like, or Glenda, one of y'all.
I don't know if you're familiar with the book Emotional Intelligence.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that kind of gets at the same idea, that self-awareness, being aware of how others perceive you, being sensitive to how you come across to other people, that kind of self-awareness has been called emotional intelligence. And I think it is something that we all should cultivate, because it enriches our relationships with others, and it enriches our own self-understanding.
In the past few, probably, I guess probably in the last two decades, I'll say, as sort of the social media has put up all these things. You ever seen one of those whiteboard illustrations? One of the first to really sort of take off was one around human empathy, and the idea that we have now are a culture that actually is embracing in human empathy in a way that other previous generations didn't. And I would say this is the Holy Spirit coming to roost. Christ's almost, the empathy that Christ had, or God had, for us in order that the incarnation happened, that Christ would come down and redeem us. That is empathy with the situation we find ourselves in. And versus sympathy, like saying, I'm sorry for that, and moving on. Empathy is, I feel that with you.
Mhm.
You know, that pain
It
there.
hurts you too.
Yeah, it is. And I think somewhere, I don't know where I wrote Little Miss Sunshine. Maybe it's before that. But if I've talked about that
Yeah.
before. Oh, and the next one, actually, right at the beginning of that. I'll come to that. Well, no, I'll just say it now. Little Miss Sunshine is a scene where this kid finds out that he's not going to be a fighter pilot because he's colorblind, and he stopped. They're all going on a beauty pageant for this little girl who's really, you know, probably shouldn't be in beauty pageants. She doesn't fit the mold, but she's there anyways doing it. And she runs, and this kid starts screaming the F word, and I want out of the car, and the dad pulls over, and the kid jumps out of the van and runs down the hill, and is just screaming the F word. I want it, you know, and just sits down there, and they're like, "How are we gonna get him? We're gonna be late for the pageant. We gotta go get him." And they're like, "You go get him. No, you go get him. Let's talk to him. How do we get him back?" It's like, how do we convince him to get back in the van? And in the end, the little girl who is in the pageants and, you know, and her little awkward self walks down, doesn't say anything to her brother, sits down next to him. And in kind of even in an awkward way, puts her arm around him. It's not a good whole thing. Wouldn't be the first time I've had accidents in Bible study, for those of you who see me fall. But puts her arm around him and doesn't say anything and just sits with him. And in that moment, she's not sympathizing with him. She's experiencing pain, and it's not. And he taps into that ethos of the Christ dwells. I mean, from a Christian perspective, Christ dwelled with us in the mortality and the fragility of the human life. Could Jesus have died before he was crucified? Yeah. If, you know, if someone came up and took a club and just started beating on him, maybe God would have intervened, I don't know, but he had the capacity to die whenever his life was taken. So he was stuck in the same material vessel we are. But the reality in which Christ has brought into this world reorients us in a different sense of groundedness, of what it means to be grounded. Yeah. Al.
One last thing on that, on the first section on page 60, where they get into, but he writes, when we feel certain that the human soul is no longer at work in the world, it's time to make sure that ours is visible to someone somewhere. Those are some of the fruits that come from being a contemplative by catastrophe. And never forget that a few slices of bourbon soaked Trappist fruitcake can help contemplation along. And that's how we run.
Tis the season.
That's right.
Tis the season.
That's how we wound it up.
Maybe we should have a community fruitcake.
Yeah.
Anyone online? Anyone online? Do you have anything? Chris,
Or did-
Linda, no, you weren't looking. You weren't going to say
Don't be
anything.
picky.
Yeah, okay. No, but it, you know, but and even beyond, and you go down to the next thing, and he offers a poem by Thomas Merton, and I won't read the whole thing unless you want me to, but the bottom of it says. Well, I'll go up one sentence to preface it. And among the, I'll just read the whole thing. Never mind. I was like, I should go there. No, I stand among you as one who offers a small message of hope. That first, there are always people who dare to seek on the margins of society, who are not dependent on social acceptance, not dependent on social routine, and prefer a kind of free-floating existence under a state of risk. And among these people, if they are faithful to their own calling, to their own vocation, and to their own message from God, communication on the deepest level is possible. He's speaking of the church and us. And the deepest level of communication is not communication, but communion. And it doesn't mean the Lord's Supper in the same way, although I think that does function as communion. It is beyond words, it is beyond speech and beyond concept. And for me, this is why I think I tap into Taizés, because sitting around singing the same chant kind of removes ourselves from it and gives us something to focus on. But it is that contemplative, like at some point, the reality of saying, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom is going to settle into your head or into your heart or into your spirit to say, wow, that criminal didn't deserve, but it was not about merit. And that's where we see that ultimate level of grace and forgiveness. Okay, so let's move into a friendship, a love, a rescue. Anything in that? This is about his sort of encounter with Merton in its various forms. He has a couple comments, a few reflections, 4 reflections to be exact: the quest for the true self, the promise of paradox, the call to community, in the hidden wholeness in a broken world. And I will say the promise of paradox and the hidden wholeness are 2 of his books. So in some way, he points us and even the sense of the quest for the true self and the call to community are both things that he advocates. So of those reflections that he offers about his encounters with Merton's writing, what stood out to you?
I think the one that most of us as Merton brilliantly.
What page?
Observed, page 64, near the bottom. Most of us as Merton brilliantly observed, live lives of self-impersonation. I can't imagine a sadder way to die than with the sense that I never showed up here on earth as my God-given self. So I was just an impersonator. Posers, what do the kids call them?
Yeah.
Posers.
But it is, how many kids grow up in that environment?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
we fashioned a world where, and I'm not saying they don't have that problem in Africa or South America, but when, when the life and the culture surrounds you is different, the sense of having that much freedom to control and to project that sense of image is not even there. We have been given a luxury that is both have joys and challenges to it. What else?
Hey, Jason,
Yeah, Denny.
the paradox on the next page on 65.
Yep.
Actually, it's a question that part about, about the opposite of let's see, where is it? The opposite of a correct statement is a false statement, but the opposite of a profound truth may be another profound truth. What is an example of that?
The one that comes to mind is we are all reprobate and we are all elect. Reprobate. So in the Reformed tradition, Calvin says the elect will go to heaven, the reprobate will go to hell, essentially. That God has elected some, and then in the passage in Romans, that's where he gets some of that stuff. We're predestined, foreordained to this sort of role of Christ's children. A lot of people don't like Calvin's doctrine of double predestination that says if God elects some, God damns others. Karl Barth, a neo-reformed theologian of the last century, said there's a paradox that we don't want to accept, and that is something can be something and something. In other words, we can be both the elect in Christ, but reprobate in Adam. But both of those realities exist seemingly in contradiction. How can you be reprobate? How can you be cast into hell? How can you be destined for that, but then also be elect? Well, the reality it's like Paul's dichotomy of flesh and spirit. How are we both flesh and spirit? There's a paradox in there. Whereas in the last century, during the scientific revolution that sort of came to full fruition in the last, I would probably say from when we started thinking about it, the 1940s, ultimately up till the present day, the idea that everything is everything is concrete has been broken down. That idea of postmodernity, that science and religion don't, like, if I were to say to you, how many of you think science and religion are contradictory? Now, maybe you're more enlightened because you're all up here, but if you ask largely a boomer crowd, Templeton did research on this, on the views of the public opinion of science and religion. Most boomers, when in particular boomer Christians, in particular evangelical boomer Christians, see science as a anti-Christian.
Most scientists are Christian.
Well, and I don't want to judge any scientist's spirituality, but I would say most scientists have a greater respect for creationism than we give them credit for. But because of the evolution of Darwinism in the 1800s, and there was this reactionary thing that said, "Oh, we have to jettison any notion of science because we can only uphold." And so this is why when you go to the petrified forest or something, and you say, "Well, how's it this says there's something that's millions of years old?" And it contradicts what I've been taught in my evangelical tradition about God created everything in 7 literal days. Well, there's nothing in our doctrinal statements that would say that God created in 7 literal days other than our interpretation of that. Again, falls into the category of liberal theology, defining what we want God to be, as opposed to taking it as a face value. But that contradiction of saying if we have science buttress against that somehow the creationism that we want to confess that God created all things is now false. And what Parker Palmer does in his book, I don't know if it's called The Promise of Paradox. Yeah, The Promise of Paradox. If you want to read it, I have it. It is that in the cross we see the paradox of God, that in weakness, it's not in strength that Christ came. That's the ultimate example. Christ came on the cross, and the cross we see that paradox. It was in Christ's crucifixion the world is redeemed, not in through the power of God that we see. The power of God was found in the very thing that we would find at least in a child, a baby, humility, being beaten and being put to death. And in doing that, humanity is restored and redeemed. That's paradoxical in its very nature, because it says everything that is akin to our own understanding of survival says might makes right. Biggest tribe, the strongest tribe, that which has most power will survive. And God says, I'm going to flip this whole kingdom upside down. And which is why I say, when I said earlier, we have an argument. We sort it out. I mean, like the fact that I reconciled with the church in Seattle that violently fired me and tore my family's life apart and sent me into probably the darkest time of my life. The fact that and this isn't like, hey, Jason's great at reconciling, but it was because it was a long process, 4 or 5 years that it took me to get through that process. But the fact that I reconciled is not about my own ethics around reconciliation. It's about the fact that I was teaching about reconciliation and that we're called to it. And therefore, when I reconcile with that church, it says to anyone else who's been a pastor fired by a church, reconciliation is possible. If Jason, and I've had people say that, if Jason can reconcile with Tim and George, then I too can find reconciliation. And we're meant to have that sense of the reality of this world that says, forget it, I don't have to argue, I don't have to be around you, I'll just ignore you. I can live with my hatred of you, my dissent, and no, that's not what we're called to. We're called to a different ethic. We're called to a different way of living, because we're called to bring in the light that God has given us into this world, so that we may proclaim that light by how we live with one another. Yeah, Al.
On page 65, down towards the bottom there, he went through a lot of that depression stage too. We had 3 sets where he said, in the darkness 3 times, but this one part I thought was interesting, where he goes, my God, why have you forsaken me? Was the question I asked time and again as I was plunged into darkness in spite of my light. In response, Merton's lived understanding of paradox came to my rescue to be whole. I must be able to say that I am both shadow and light.
Yeah. And that's paradox.
So,
yeah. It's like the kingdom of God is in the future, but it is also now. That's paradoxical. Which is it? It's not an either or.
Both and.
It's a both and really that's like a good German theology sort of theological disposition in most German writers, is there's no either or, it's always both and, which is why Karl Barth brings us, we are the both and in Christ. We are both reprobate and elect.
Jason.
Yeah, Denny, did I not answer the question?
Something that kind of follows along, I think follows along that what you're saying. It's a little later. It's a statement that Black Elk made. It says, whether it happened that way, I do not know. But if you think about it, you will see that it is true. And that kind of follows along with what you're saying.
What page are you on, Denny?
Well, that's on 82. That's further on down the line.
And is that in the next chapter?
No, it's in the same chapter at the end.
Back, okay. Yeah, no, it is. I mean, and that is there's a sense of, and I think that we as a community of faith, we can live like this. We can live with a greater sense of who are we to be. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to be a learning community. We're trying to be a serving community. We're trying to live into the reality of the light to which we are called. So this is a whole notion of yin and yang, by the way. There's always a little bit there's a balance in life that we often don't see, but is still there. Anything else?
So it talks in the call to community on 68. Merton goes on to say, there's the quote, and then it says in the middle of the quote, you cannot rely on structures. You've got to have a foundation under the structure. Yeah. Which speaks true. And let me just read the whole thing it's a quote from Merton. It says, we can no longer rely on being supported by structures that may be destroyed at any moment by political powers or political force.
I mean, that describes exactly where we're at in our world right
Exactly.
now. I mean, you couldn't
Yeah.
even have said it better. You cannot rely on structures. They are good and they should help us, and we should do the best we can with them, but they may be taken away. And if everything is taken away, what do you do next? And I think that we probably defy that a little bit here in Lake City. We're like, you know what? The world can all just go to pot, and we're still here in Lake City. Well, you know, my kids were like, we can blow the bridges up on the both ends of the town, and we got an arsenal. We got deer and fish. We can survive. It's just us. But there is that thing. That what if is it all? What if it's all taken away? Then
Well,
what?
that's what
Then
she
what
was saying
matters?
earlier about what we were saying the other day about
Ukraine, everything's
from
taken
Ukraine,
away.
everything's taken away, so there is no material.
Well, this is why Christianity is going gangbusters in the Southern Hemisphere.
Mm-hmm.
And we in the Northern Hemisphere are like, you know, I don't like church. I'm going to hop around 10 times before I find something that I don't like. But in South America and Africa and Asia, you see, in India, you see these movements of people who are just because there's poverty,
Right.
and they're stripped of a lot of the material things that we define ourselves with. You know, I just listened to a comedian called Shang Wang, and it's on Netflix. It's a good one. He starts off and he says, I finally let go of life. I've let go of my ego. I bought pants at Costco.
I love it.
That's how you know someone really doesn't care. Where'd you get your pants? Costco, you know?
What if you buy them at Walmart? You really
So-
found the answer.
He said, you got nothing left to live if you buy your pants at Costco. And then I bought some pants at Costco. Anything else on up to in this chapter? Hidden wholeness. Just a nod of the head towards the intergenerational stuff at the end of 69, last chapter. I knew that step one in stopping real estate practices that manipulated fear to generate profit was simple. He's talking about the situation above that. Give old timers and newcomers frequent chances to meet face to face so that they can learn that the other came bearing blessings, not threats. And it just reminded me of the fact that this whole issue, I mean, like our generational divide. You know, young people don't respect old people in the same way and old people don't like young people in the same way. And part of it is because the whole society is fragmented, and it's every generation for themselves. So
I still think that the media and social media is a big part of that.
yeah, that's why I really don't do much on it. You know?
You know, one interesting movie I saw years ago was about Christmas armistice. What am I trying to say? Anyway, the ceasefire that was created on
Oh.
Christmas Eve in World War I.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Where German forces and American
Yeah, yeah.
Played
forces
soccer.
played soccer and ate a meal together and looked at each other and said, we're alike. We want to go back to our families. And then it was, they went back to the trenches, and next day they were killing them, trying to kill each
Well,
other.
they were fighting because
But
the
the-
government said they had to, not
Exactly,
because
but-
they wanted
But
to.
here, what they're talking about, they're interposing where the forces are trying to force you apart. If you would let these folks talk, and if they would talk amongst themselves, they'd probably find a way, like Jason was saying, you work it out. They would work it out.
They were.
Yeah,
And they might not like, but they would get to it and they'd agree to it. And that's what they found, that when you read about that and see it in that movie, that was really powerful. That
Yeah.
These guys were looking at each other going, wow, what are we doing?
mhm. Well, I think that if you've ever volunteered, you know, for the youth programs at church, or if you get involved with the kids that came over and cleaned the limbs up from the ice and all that, we have a lifetime relationship now. They contact me all the time, but they're
High school kids.
yeah, few and far between, and I think it was just an openness that we spend a lot of time with them.
Anyone online? Just keep checking with you. Bottom of 70. When I die, I won't be asking about the bottom line, meaning, you know, probably financially. I'll be asking if I was faithful to my gifts, to the needs that I saw around me, and the ways that I engaged those needs with my gifts. Faithful, that is, to the value, rightness, and truth of offering the best to the world that I had, as best as I could. And I think that's a powerful way of reminding. I mean, it's like, you know, you can't take it with you. And in the end, what the legacy you'll known by is, you know, your things that are more simple. Were we faithful in how we lived our lives? We have a gift here in Lake City. We have a tremendous gift to live in this community. Are we as a community being intentional about how we live that life faithfully? I mean, there's still brokenness in this community that needs Christ's light shown on it.
Yeah.
Are we light bearers wherever we go? And that sense of faithfulness when it happens as a community, you know, I'm not convinced that we can't that there still couldn't be a spiritual renewal in this little town that was unlike anything else. And I think that begins with a community that is living its life truly as we're called to in the light of Christ. But I think we got to wrestle with some of this stuff. And I love the fact that, you know, our congregation is mostly 70 plus folks. That means that you have more, that the risk you can take is greater. You have more time to love, you have more time to serve, you have more time, and going out, you know, screaming in service is way better than going out silently. I didn't mean service and worship service, just to be clear. If you scream in service, we'll have a problem. Okay, let's move on. Down is the way down is the way to well-being. 71, starting from 71 on. This is about groundedness.
I thought that was a very interesting thing, because most of the time you strive to go up, but a lot of times you're not grounded in what you do.
Yeah.
And so I think that was kind of meant something to me.
What's funny is that it had all this language about altitude and living high.
Yeah.
I think that doesn't really apply. Living at altitude is dangerous. Like I was like, he didn't write this for people living at this altitude. I saw my life. I think I saw my life. I think I saw my move to Lake City as as somewhat of a groundedness. I was on a different path. I was climbing a corporate, ecclesial ladder, and all things were looking great. And I think I got to the point where I said, I'm living in an illusion that is not going to make me happy. Like I said, I was teaching people how to raise their children in the faith, but I wasn't home to raise my own child in the faith. And at the end of the day, if I'm not faithful in the very first thing I'm called to, but it's a different type of faithfulness. Now we have hundreds of hikers that travel through here and see Christ's hospitality. That wouldn't, there's all sorts of things that can happen when you actually, put other things on hold.
Well, and you talk about catastrophe, and I told you this before. If you hadn't gone through that horrible experience with getting fired, you wouldn't have ultimately ended up here with us.
Well, I was trying to end up here before I went there. I often say, what if I had just come here? But I think you guys would have been.
Maybe you needed to go
I think I needed some ripening to come here.
You did.
I do say, I often say, I don't think if I had come here like 10 years, like in 2009, I don't think it would have been the same relationship.
No, and you probably would have gotten bored very easily and just wanted to move on.
Yeah.
Whereas now you love us.
Right.
My dad had all these sayings that, and one of them that I remember is that, when I was going through a particularly rough thing in high school, and he said, if you've never tasted bitter, you won't appreciate sweet.
Yeah. Right.
So this idea of why people have moved here, and you kind of alluded to earlier what's possible here, what could be here. And I think that why people move here.
A little louder. I see people struggling to hear you.
That why people moved here is one that needs to get explored. I know there's a core of the community here has been here forever. I think.
That's born
Linda?
here.
Okay,
That's forever.
there's this core people group. Okay. Who I think some of you have left and come back, but some of you have stayed. Right? But then there's a lot of us that have moved here for both positive and negative, when I say negative, leaving negative reasons.
Yeah.
I don't know. You know, it'd be kind of nice to have the book with everybody's story.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, not
Yeah. I know quite a
that
few
there might
people
be that might be too much
Yeah.
info, but
Well, I've
you know,
always said, when we got here, somebody from the Chamber of Commerce needs to put out a book that shows everybody's family history, relationship, who's married to who,
Oh,
when, and this and
yeah.
all this. So you don't walk into a restaurant and say something and you're like, you're related to who? Oh,
Yeah.
I mean, literally, it is a,
Yeah. Well,
Oh,
and
yeah.
a lot of people went away, and particularly kids, once they graduate, they leave because there's not a lot for that age group and stuff. But then you see them come back.
Yeah.
10 years later or 15 years later. And
Well, and I think there's a sense of groundedness here. It's a different way of life. It's like living in a little bit like living in a foreign country. But I think you're right, Roy. I think that there's a value to understanding why people come, in a sense of what are we seeking, like
Well,
what you know.
when we told people who were leaving Houston to move here, we had a lot of friends, a lot of people who moved. Like, are you crazy? Why would you go? You know, first thing is you could get frozen in. You know, you could get snowed in. I'm like, yeah,
That'd be a
most of the
good
locals
thing.
say no, and besides, if that happened, it might be kind of neat.
Yeah.
You know, but then I tell them, I say it's a different kind of existence. I use those words.
Yeah.
It's a different kind of existence.
We live differently.
And then, you know, sometimes I'll explain it's not so much about all the stuff you need. You know, one of the things I'll say, if you need to go to the mall, you probably don't belong there.
Yeah.
Well, I think the
Slippery.
thing-
If you ask how close is Target, you probably don't want to be.
You know, that has many meanings on many different levels.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. I think some way to explore more of that. Maybe the key to how do you unlock some of the things you were alluding to earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know, the thing about that too is I think people, although people my age have moved here and I'm still existing in my vocation, many of the people who don't already live here are moving here because they're retiring. And that mindset of retirement is something that is a product of the last century. Retirement did not exist before the 1900s, and like others was wealthy, you know, like the aristocracy, you know, Downton Abbey sort of stuff. But the idea that you come here to retire already puts you in a disposition of, I'm going to put it on cruise and chill.
Yeah. In my case, I came here climbing the 14ers in the 80s with 8 other people. And I'm the only one of them that lived here. But I'm a very emotional and a very feeling kind of a guy. And this felt right to me. And while I was still working, I came back here every summer when I could because I felt right here.
Yeah.
I thought
know
it
what
was
it
right to have my kids in school here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this was the closest to heaven on earth that I could find. That's how I feel about
Yeah.
Lake City.
I think there's a groundedness here. You strip your life of a lot of the things that you know, we live a different life. And to that end, I think that one of the things that I think that he says here, where is it? Where was it? Those external oughts, those things that have driven most of your vocational careers, living out here, what you should do with your life, have often been the driving force in his life. When I fail to live up to them and see how often up sneaks up in our talk about the good life, I judge myself as weak and faithless, and I was stuck in that stage of more development where one has high aspirations and equal highs levels of guilt about falling short. It's a formula for the good life, I tell you. Aim high, hit low, and feel lousy about yourself as you go. And I think this place is a remedy to that.
Yes.
It says that didn't matter.
So I have something that relates to
Yeah.
something else on page 70.
Let me turn this around, and can you speak loudly so those online can hear you?
On the top of page 75, it says, true self
Yes.
is the self with which we arrive on earth, the self that simply wants us to be who we were born to be. Then flipping back to page 64 and the part that says the quest for true self, I have a note, and it says, a note from Marcia to Marcia. You can't not do this. And that's kind of what we're talking about, like
Mhm.
moving to Lake City. It doesn't make sense in the real world to live as isolated as this, but I think a lot of us say we can't not do
Yeah.
that. And that's who we are, part of who we are. And yay, yes, for being here. But some people don't, they don't have the feeling for it. The new couple, Tammy and George, I was talking to him Sunday, and I said, because they have just loved it here. And I said, you should move here. Oh, no. And then he whipped out his phone and showed me a picture of his son, who is a surfer, on the beach with his little 3-year-old grandson. He says, I couldn't live without the beach.
Yeah.
So it's all your own
Mhm.
perspective.
Yeah.
Right.
Everybody
Your own-
doesn't have, thank goodness
Thank
they
goodness.
don't.
Yeah, thank goodness they all don't
Yeah, they don't have that. Yes. Yeah, this
Yeah,
is-
you're right.
And when you think about it, we're a very, very small majority.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
it's-
we are.
And it's just not for everybody.
No, but it also means that it's not just the environment and the remoteness that we're embracing. I really think there's a part of about like and honestly, people ask me why I got involved in the OHV survey thing that we're doing. If you haven't taken it, please. But and it's because for me it doesn't make a difference. It's not about whether OHV is here or not OHV is. It's about the community that I live in, and I want the community I live in to have a sense of harmony and equilibrium. I don't want to go into a place and feel like someone is looking at me and feels estranged from me because of a perspective I have. I'd rather say, how do we as a community put community? My bias is not having OHVs. My bias is having community.
Yes.
So, but I think that sense of willingness to live into that sense of sacrifice for the sake of community is both something that people bring here and both something that not everyone does. So, yeah, Al.
Just moving kind of forward, because
Yeah, we're getting close.
I was just taking the diary. and
Yeah.
Thinking
What-
back through the diary, of sleeping by yourself in the woods in the winter.
Let's jump into the
that
diary.
kind
Yeah.
of thing. And the thing that jumps out at me kind of towards the end of that is, and remember, he goes through this thing where he fixed bacon and eggs one day and he considers himself a klutz. I object to the word klutz, by the way, especially with my initials, A. Lutz. A.K. Lutz, Alvin Kenneth Lutz. A. Klutz. I object to those terms.
I'll
Right
never
now.
forget that.
You've just given me a bunch of jokes in my
You're
head.
overruled.
You use them, you're all condemned.
You're overruled.
But anyway, he fixes his bacon and eggs. And he just loves, I did real well. Next day he fixes oatmeal and he screws it up. Okay, and then at night, he wakes up 2 a.m. He's got these dark thoughts. I'm like, how come you woke up at 2 a.m? He thinks, oh, the world's falling in and all this. So he's got here on 79, memo to self. Remember that you are never in your own right mind at 2 a.m. Get outside and air out your brain as often as possible. Look for love in all the right places. Venus isn't a bad place to start. The planet he's talking about. When all else fails, make coffee. Now I'm going to go take a nap.
Yeah, yes.
Then on the other next page going forward with some of the other things, he talks about how humor and laughter is so important. And he puts down there are 3 things which are real: God, human folly, and laughter. The first 2 are beyond our comprehension, so we must do what we can with the third, which is laughter. And I thought that,
That's great.
that laughter builds you up rather than all the depression. But just as going through all of those stages of being by himself and contemplating.
Yeah.
And the things that he would do, you could just sort of picture yourself in
Oh,
there.
yeah.
Boy, I blew that, this and that at 2 o'clock. I don't know about going out in bear season at 2 o'clock. Standing there going, what am I doing here?
I noted that to tack on to that, Al, the 3 things which are real in the world, and I would put it in a God, sin, and joy. I think laughter comes out of a place of joy, and that joy is something that I think we are created. I mean, you all know I like to play games, and my theology of play is that God instilled us in that Genesis account that I read. Joy we were meant to be creatures of joy. and the need to have to, and I read the part about we were given plants for food. We were given tasks, we were given a role, we were given purpose, we were given community, we were given provision. And then when we sinned and the human folly comes into play, we're cast into this world where now all of a sudden we don't just pick fruit, we have to cultivate in the ground, where we're not, where the woman is, feels dominated by the man, and where, you have this whole broken social structure that immediately enters into this world in a way that robs us of that joy. And so there are many theologians who are joy theologians who feel like that's really what when we exist in a genuine state of joy, we exist as we were created to be. And perhaps that, what time is it now? We have about 6 minutes left, but if anyone else wants to comment, but I think at the heart of who we're called to be, and I think that's what we seek out. We seek peace and joy in that sense of, serenity, in that sense of completeness and wholeness and groundedness. In the years that I have, over the decade and a half that I've studied the Taizé community, and again, 100,000, we think we're busy here. Taizé has 5,000 to 6,000 in their summer months alone in weeks. Each week they have a rotation of 5,000 to 6,000 young people coming through. 100,000, and they say every one of those young people, the goal is not to give them a spiritual high. And that's often when we talk about camp or retreat or coming to the mountains. We leave on such a high. And I've never left Taizé on a spiritual high. I've always left with a spiritual grounding, with a sense of call, with a sense of purpose, with the sense of going out to bring the light of the world and of God into the world. And I think that those who come here seek some of that, and we have an opportunity in a profound way to bring joy, to guide that, to engage that, to be a learning community, to be a community of joy, to be a community of hospitality, to welcome hikers in that way. That their lives are transformed. I guarantee you there are hikers that came through here and thought, wow, what did we just walk through? And they'll remember us long beyond.
I hear that all the time.
Okay, any final thoughts as we close out? Anyone online? Anything online?
I totally agree with you, Jason. Not Joy. I'd like to say that it's not only a mental thing, but joy is a very physical thing that's very, very important in our lives. And man cannot live without it, actually, not successfully.
A theology of joy, essentially, is what we all need. And I think that's found in a theology of play. But so as we end this out, then, let me read again, as we did earlier, the welcome home as he ends this chapter. Before I do, I will say it next week is work and vocation. He's going to talk a lot about his writing, and that's where his vocation is. I'd encourage you as we meet before we meet next week, to put that in line of your own sense of vocation. That sense of vocation is not your job. It's what you feel like you were, contributed, what you did in this world. It's not being defined by that vocation in the worldly sense, but reminding ourselves that our vocation actually comes from God. Welcome home. In the alien, snow-blown woods, moving hard to stay warm in zero weather, I stop on a rise to catch my breath as the sun, setting through the bare-boned trees, falls upon my face, fierce and full of life. Breathing easy now, breathing with the earth, I suddenly feel accepted. I feel myself stand on my own ground, strong, deep-rooted as a tree, while time and all these troubles disappear. And when, who knows how long, I move down on the trail to find my ancient burdens returning, I stop once more to say no to them, not here, not now, not ever, reclaiming the welcome home the woods have given me. Amen.
Amen.
And God be with you as you go.
And also
And also with
And
you.
we'll see you all next week.